You're saying low carb is a band-aid approach.
Yeah, it's really not something that we can understate. Carbs aren't the problem. The insulin isn't the problem. These are just symptoms. These are just effects of what's actually going on underneath. I was in that low carb camp myself and doing intermittent fasting and cyclical ketogenic diets and all the different variations. What we'll often hear is stop eating carbohydrates because that's where we're getting that glucose from. And that's also what stimulates insulin to be produced. And we see high insulin and high glucose and we say that's not good. So have less of those things. But we're really kind of looking at it backward, right? We're not actually addressing that underlying piece, which is that we're not actually using the fuel that's coming in. Instead, we're kind of training our body to expect stress more and more. And in doing so, it starts to downregulate our different systems, our immune function, our digestive function, our reproductive function, because this is not a time to be providing as much energy as possible and running at full capacity. I think sleep is one, if not the most common symptom when people are on low carb carnivore diets. Just one night of poor sleep, that triggers stress, that triggers cortisol, it triggers anxiety and irritability. It is the same signal that causes fat storage, something we don't want to happen because that affects everything from how much energy we have, how well we think, our mood, and so many other things. One of the things that kind of flipped everything on its head for me, that just completely shifted my perspective, was
Throughout this video, Jay uses the word engine to represent mitochondria. The mitochondria is where our bodies produce energy. So for me to be able to clap my hands, move my arms, and talk right now, this all requires energy. And the energy is being produced in the mitochondria. So again, whenever Jay says the engines aren't working or the engines have broken down, he's referring to the engines being the mitochondria where energy is produced. Also, if you're new to the channel, my name's Lillie. I'm a certified nutrition health coach, and I'm on a mission to help people live their most abundant lives, stop eating processed junk food, and eat more real whole foods. That said, I actually eat a pretty low carb diet myself, and I found a low carb diet to help me maintain my weight, have lots of energy, feel really good. And so there's some things that Jay says that I don't fully agree with him on, but regardless, I do have one-on-one clients who they've tried eating a low carb, keto, or carnivore diet, and it just doesn't work for them, and it actually makes their health worse. And so I hope that through this conversation, maybe for those people, they can have just some more ideas and a different perspective on how to optimize their health. I recognize the internet can be so confusing because we can find videos of people saying one thing and then find videos of people saying the complete opposite thing to be true, and it just gets very overwhelming and even frustrating knowing who to listen to and what's actually going to work. That said, I would encourage, if you're currently thriving eating a low carb diet, then I would not watch this video and start second guessing and questioning if what I'm doing is working. If you're currently losing weight, reversing your insulin resistance, feeling fantastic eating lower carb, then I wouldn't change a thing. But for those who aren't seeing success and aren't thriving, then I hope you find some value in this video. And today's video is sponsored by Lumino, which is the #1 oral natural care brand on Amazon. You guys know I'm very particular about the ingredients and chemicals and things that I'm putting in and on my body, and that also includes the things that I wash my mouth with. And so the Lumino products are certified non-toxic, microbiome safe, peroxide-free, and enamel safe, using really clean ingredients like Dead Sea salt, coconut oil, and lemon peel. They're also a whitening toothpaste, and they also have whitening strips, which I used to use whitening strips in the past, but they had, lots of chemicals, peroxide, things in there that I didn't want to put in my oral microbiome. So I had stopped using those, but I now have found Lumino, which they've whitened my teeth, but they don't have those bad chemicals and ingredients that I don't want. So if you're looking for a cleaner product for mouthwash, toothpaste, whitening strips, then be sure to use the link in the video description to get 25% off the Lumino whitening pack, which includes 2 toothpastes and 7 strips of the whitening strips. Thank you guys for all of your support, and I hope you guys enjoy the video. Jay, we're going to talk a lot about insulin resistance, and I think just to give people, why should people care about insulin resistance? Why is this important? Why do you care about not having insulin resistance? And let's just start with that.
Yeah, that's a great question. And so insulin resistance is something that, medically is related to every chronic health condition. It's kind of the centerpiece of metabolic syndrome, which is then related to diabetes, cardiovascular disease, and tons of other related issues. So it's very central in terms of medical concerns. But in addition to that, what insulin resistance means is that certain aspects of our cells, some really important aspects, are not working well. And that's obviously something we don't want to be happening either, because that affects everything from how well we sleep, how much energy we have, how well we think, our mood, body composition, and so many other things. So it's a really central piece of health.
So, what for you is the reason? I'm sure there's many reasons, but what causes insulin resistance?
Yeah, so even by its name, insulin resistance tells us that we're thinking about an issue with insulin, and that's kind of a step separate from the real underlying problem. So what happens in insulin resistance is essentially the mitochondria in our cells, which are the engines of our cells that use the fuel that comes in and convert it into energy. Those engines are not working properly. And so there is a kind of backup of the fuel that's coming in. So the cells are overfilled because the engines aren't working and we can't fit any more fuel in. It starts to back up and we start to see that fuel enter into the blood. And that's where you get high levels of blood sugar, high blood glucose. That's one very common feature of insulin resistance. The other is that insulin is the signal that helps to bring that fuel into the cell. So it's helping to bring, in this case, we're talking about glucose inside the cell so it can be used in the engine. And when the cell is full of glucose, because it's not being used in the engine, insulin can't do its job, right? It's not able to bring more glucose in, even though there's a lot in the blood that wants to be taken into the cells. And so then our bodies try to compensate by producing more and more insulin. So you end up with those two basic features that describe insulin resistance, which is a lot of glucose and a lot of insulin, and cells that aren't actually using the glucose that's coming in, the carbohydrates that are coming in. And so that's kind of the essence of it, which then leads to a lot of other issues, because if our cells and engines are not working properly and they aren't producing energy, the ATP that is needed for every single cellular process, everything that we do requires ATP. If that's not working properly, then a lot of things are going to go wrong. And so that's really what insulin resistance is that situation. And then we're just seeing all these downstream effects as a result of it.
So how did we get to that being a problem? Was it someone ate too much? Was it ate too much of the wrong kinds of food? Was it sleep? Was it stress? Was it not exercising? Like, what is the actual action step where if someone's like, I don't want that to happen, I don't want bad things to happen with my cells and my mitochondria, what should they be doing on their daily, in a daily habit or lifestyle basis?
Yeah, and it's a great question, because what most of us think, or kind of the typical perspective, whether in the medical community or alternative health community, is that we're seeing all this extra glucose, we're seeing all this extra insulin, and instead of the recognition that the engine isn't working, we see all the extra fuel and we say the fuel is the problem. And so what we'll often hear is stop eating carbohydrates, because that's where we're getting that glucose from, that's where we're getting that fuel from, and that's also what stimulates insulin to be produced. And we see high insulin and high glucose, and we say that's not good, so have less of those things. But we're really kind of looking at it backward, right? We're not actually addressing that underlying piece, which is that we're not actually using the fuel that's coming in. So that's kind of the first problem. But if we do recognize carbs aren't the problem, the insulin isn't the problem, these are just symptoms, these are just effects of what's actually going on underneath, then we can start to actually address the underlying issue. And the kind of good and bad news is that everything that we do affects how well those engines work. So, and again, we're talking about the mitochondria here, and basically everything from how many like nutrients we have, whether we're getting nutrients from our food, how much stress we're under, how well we're sleeping, how much we're moving, the kinds of foods that are coming in, the types of carbohydrates or fats that we're eating, how well our gut health is, or how good our gut health is, how well we digest our food, all of those things will end up affecting how well the engines work. And so on one hand, this means there's a lot that we can do to improve that situation. On the other hand, it also means that we have to consider all of these different aspects of what's going on with our health. Instead of just saying, stop eating carbohydrates, we actually want to look at all of the different things that go into a healthy life. And that's going to be where we can actually improve the function of those engines and actually allow for ourselves to use the carbohydrates that are coming in. And that's how we reverse something like insulin resistance.
So I had Dr. Ted Naiman on. Actually, I had multiple doctors come on and explain this kind of topic where people can be eating low carb and still have high glucose numbers and still be insulin resistant. I work with clients one-on-one, and for a lot of them, eating less carbs helps with their insulin resistance and helps with them improving their diabetes markers and blood panels. But then there's a select percentage of people who it just does not work. And like I'm thinking you're alluding to is that's kind of the Band-Aid approach. Oh, just don't have carbs. And that's like the Band-Aid approach, which is still not getting to the root cause. I've had certain people, and I had a client yesterday who there's someone who they can't lower their carbs anymore. They're at zero. They can't do anything else. And yet their fasting blood sugars are going up. Their A1C is going up. It's just something where what are we supposed to do? I can't reduce any more carbs. And so I've explained to them before, well, clearly your body is producing more sugars. If you then brought in some sugar, it would then allow your body to not have to be forced to create so much sugar. And then what ends up happening is, then their blood sugars end up coming down, ironically, and it's such a mind frack for them because they hear online, eat less sugar, eat less carbohydrates. And then I'm like, yeah, but you clearly are doing that right now and it's not working. So let's just try the opposite. And I've had people lower their blood sugar readings by 50 to 100 points in just a week or 2 weeks. And it's insane when I start bringing in more carbohydrates. And it's a mind frack. But yeah, could you add on to any of that? Why would people's A1C and glucose be rising without sugar?
Yeah, it's definitely something that I see as well. And there's a central piece there that's connecting the lack of carbs coming in and our body's producing a lot of sugar, and that's stress and energy. But just to bookmark that real quick, one thing you had mentioned was when we take out the carbs, a lot of times we see the markers of insulin resistance improve, right? We see blood sugar decrease, we see A1C decrease, which hemoglobin A1C is an average measure of our glucose over time. And we might see improvements in insulin levels as well. But what we want to remember is that when we're talking about the fuel kind of overflowing, we're looking at the fuel and saying there's excess fuel here. If we stop providing that fuel, if we stop providing the carbohydrates, there will be less fuel. It doesn't actually mean we fixed the engine problem. It just means we're not seeing the overflow right now. And so that's important to recognize as well, which is that just because we're improving these markers of insulin resistance doesn't mean we're actually improving insulin resistance itself and the underlying problem. There still might be value to that. Like there is still a place where if you're not using the carbs well, you might have some benefits by reducing them, but we want to remember that it's not actually addressing the underlying issue there. And coming back to the question of in the situation that we're seeing glucose come up, in the situation that we're seeing A1C come up when we're on a low carb diet, what's typically happening is because we're removing the fuel, we're removing the source that we're producing energy from, our cells are saying there's not enough energy here, and they're asking for more fuel and more energy. And the way that they do that is by triggering stress hormones. It's an entire stress response. It's the same thing that happens if we don't eat at all, if we go for a long run or do any sort of exercise, if we were to do anything that's, if we were under like psychological stress, or again, if we're not eating carbohydrates, our bodies induce this stress response to provide fuel. And the most well-known stress hormone here is called cortisol. So a lot of people are familiar with that. There are a couple of others as well, namely glucagon and adrenaline or epinephrine. These are the main stress hormones. And when we increase these stress hormones, it triggers a number of processes, but one of them is a process called gluconeogenesis, which is the process of producing new glucose, right? Producing carbohydrates. And this is what happens when we don't consume them. And so when we're not consuming them, our bodies will produce some on their own. Now, as you said, there are situations where those values are actually increasing, right? We have higher glucose, higher A1C. What's going on in that process is we are under excessive amounts of stress, high amounts of these stress hormones producing lots and lots of this sugar. And of course, we're not using it well because the engines aren't working effectively or as effectively as they could. And that's where we end up in this situation where we're not eating the carbohydrates, but we're excessively producing them. So as I'm kind of getting at, the central issue here is a lack of energy and excess stress. And
the energy, just to clarify, you're specifically meaning carbohydrates because you can get energy from fat.
Yeah, you can. So the fuels aren't used exactly the same. And without getting into the details of biochemistry, we always can come back to it, but the efficiency with which we produce energy from fats is not equal to when we use carbohydrates. This is part of why our brains can't use fatty acids as a fuel. They would have to use either glucose or ketones. But the rest of our bodies don't really have those ketones available, even if we're not eating any carbs. So the rest of our bodies have to choose either glucose or fats, and there's an inherent inefficiency that comes along with the fat as a fuel compared to glucose. And so when we are relying solely on the fats, we end up with less energy than we would if we were relying on some amount or having some amount of carbohydrates there. And that triggers this signal of stress. So when I'm saying stress here, it's not necessarily like we're under stress from work or from relationships or something like that, it's our body's response. It's physiological stress, the same stress as if we were to exercise for a long time. And so that situation, as you were saying, can be rectified. We can reverse that just by providing the actual fuel that our bodies are asking for. And this is, I think, I was in that low carb camp myself and doing intermittent fasting and cyclical ketogenic diets and all the different variations. One of the things that kind of flipped everything on its head for me, that just completely shifted my perspective, was this recognition that the number one way to turn down cortisol is providing carbohydrates, eating carbohydrates, whether we're talking fruit or sweet potatoes or whatever it is. That is going to immediately turn down cortisol by providing the actual fuel that our bodies are asking for. And so that's exactly what we're doing in this case, right? You have someone who's on lower carb, they're seeing this excess stress response, these high glucose values, and we provide some carbohydrates and it turns that stress off. And so that we're seeing that, play out in real time.
So I'm just thinking about my audience and what they're going to be thinking. And so I'm just going to be them in this moment. Mm-hmm. So Jay, my cortisol levels were really high. My body was gaining more weight. I was therefore in a state of more inflammation, more stress, because I was eating carbohydrates. I was eating pizza. I was eating donuts, and that wasn't helping me get lean and fit and strong. I was giving my body the carbohydrates it needs. So how can carbohydrates now be the thing that helps me sleep, have better thyroid function, stronger metabolism, if I was already doing that and it messed me up?
Yeah, so I think those are good examples, right? When we think carbohydrates, we're thinking donuts, pizza, candy, cookies, whatever it is. A couple of things to mention there. One is those foods, for the most part, are more fat than they are carbohydrates, right? This is not just a pure carbohydrate food in any of these examples. Also, the types of fats and carbohydrates are far from ideal. They have a lot of problems with them beside, lack of nutrients. There's issues with the types of oils that are used in those sorts of products. There's issues with the types of carbohydrates, the grains. Those can cause a lot of irritation and gut issues for people. So the kind of short answer here is those are not the types of carbohydrates we're talking about. They're not even really carbohydrates. They're kind of like mixed foods. And if we shift the sources of carbohydrates, we can see all of those benefits without the weight gain, without the trouble sleeping, the inflammation. Those things are rarely, if ever, a carbohydrate issue, but they can be a food issue. But just because the food contains the carbohydrates doesn't mean those were the problem.
I have a lot of people who they come to more of a carnivore diet because they hear about they're just trying to lose weight. Well, we have two different camps of people. We have the people who are trying to lose weight, and then we have people who have maybe more gut issues, autoimmune responses, psoriasis, maybe even mental health issues. But for people who are just trying to lose weight, they hear about all the different diets online, and they're like, oh, there's the vegan, there's the paleo, there's Weight Watchers, there's carnivore. Oh my gosh, someone said they lost 10 pounds in a week. I'm going to do that because I'm going to lose a bunch of weight too. This just happened to me yesterday, a client who was like, oh, I just started it because I don't have any major chronic health conditions. I just wanted to lose like 10 pounds. And I ended up gaining 20 pounds in a year. And my fasting glucose went from 74 to 93. For this particular person, I was like, but why did you choose carnivore to lose weight? You could have done all these other kinds of diets to lose weight. And they're like, well, I just saw someone online lose 10 pounds in a week. It's like, well, we have to remember, where's that person's starting point? Maybe they had 100 pounds to lose. And then you could have done any other kind of diet where you calorie restricted or changed the fuel if you're eating processed junk food. If you start eating real whole foods, then you'll likely see a body composition change without even having to reduce calories. But yeah, I think like people who move more towards carnivore, let's exclude the weight loss people, I guess, but for people who they say that if they have a little bit of some blueberries, then they're going to end up eating a plethora of blueberries, and then the sweet taste ends up making them want to go and eat something else that has more sweet, like sugar taste to it. So then they go and eat Oreos and cookies and ice cream. So then they find that for them, reducing carbohydrates, reducing anything that has a resemblance of sweetness actually helps them improve their blood markers, inflammation, insulin resistance. So what do you have to say about those kinds of people?
Yeah, it's a great question. And the relationship between hunger and energy, I think, is a really important one. Just real quick on the weight side, I just want to throw out there that if we are in a place where we're looking for any sort of short-term weight loss, 1 week or 2 weeks or a month, where we're trying to lose 10, 15 pounds, whatever it is, that almost always is going to come at the cost of not only our long-term health, but also our long-term weight. most of the time, anything that's going to lead to that massive drop in weight is not going to be sustainable, or it's not going to actually be physiologically sustained. And we are going to be more prone to regaining it, and it often doesn't work long term. So just something to keep in mind there is, let's always try to keep that long term in mind. Normally, if we're looking for a short term quick fix, it will only work short term, and then it'll come at a cost. So coming back to the question of like cravings, sweet cravings, and hunger, most of us live our lives in a chronic state of restriction. Most of us in the health world, whether we are struggling with weight or it's in the name of health, most of us are restricting normally some version of calories, carbohydrates, certain types of foods. And it's a difficult way to kind of exist. And I don't think it has to be that way, but I lived that way for over a decade. So I know what that feels like. But when we're in that state, what we're doing is we're generally, whether it's by restricting carbs or just total calories, we're in that state of at least a partial energy deficit. This doesn't mean calorie deficit. I'm talking about the actual ATP inside of our different organ systems. When that happens, there is always a chronic hunger underneath, because our hunger is pretty directly tied to the amount of ATP in very particular areas, specifically in our liver and in a certain area of our brain called the hypothalamus. This is where kind of our main energy sensors are that are telling us we need to eat more so we have more energy, or we don't need to eat more. We're pretty good. It doesn't have all that much to do with how much is in our stomach at the moment, how big the meal is that we ate. We can eat a really big meal, and I'm sure, a lot of people listening to this have had this experience where they can eat a really big salad, and even though they're physically full, they still have a desire to eat more, right? If there was something really tasty in front of them, they would still want to eat it because their bodies are not actually getting the fuel that they need, right? Salads are pretty low in calories and fuel most of the time. And so those energy sensors are still saying we need more, despite the fact that we're physically full. So if we're in a situation like that, and then we were to eat something a little sweet, of course, we're going to feel like we want to have a ton of it because we're in this energy deficit. We don't have enough ATP for our brain to function optimally, and immune system and reproductive function and all of the other systems that obviously we want to be working at kind of full capacity. So when we're in that chronic state and then we eat something sweet, we eat some carbohydrates, it's like gold, right? Our bodies are really excited by that and are going to want to eat a lot. And I've had that experience. I think, it's a really common one. But if we are on a more consistent basis, fueling with the quote right types, healthy carbohydrates, and providing enough of them, that experience should go away. That feeling of the chronic underlying hunger and cravings should go away over time. But it's tough when we're coming from that kind of immediate restriction and the or sometimes long-term restriction. It can take a little while before we really recover and our hunger signals kind of re-regulate because we have enough ATP there.
So if you were someone who had insulin resistance right now, how would you go about reversing that?
Yeah, so there are a few different things I'd be thinking about. The first, as we kind of mentioned, is for a lot of people in that scenario, it's not like the typical foods they were eating from the carbohydrate side are berries and other fruits and potatoes and sweet potatoes and a lot of home cooking and good protein sources and things like that. Typically, there's a lot of processed foods, a lot of eating at restaurants, and normally not as consistent movement and exercise, maybe not great sleep habits, maybe stress. And for the vast majority of cases, just getting to kind of decent areas there, just putting some intention in those areas makes a massive difference. So before I would suggest any sort of restriction of certain food groups or anything like that, I would say, let's just eat whole foods, cook at home, incorporate some consistent movement, which doesn't have to be hours at the gym multiple times a week. It can just be consistent walking or something you enjoy, right? It could be any kind of sport or anything that's active, that, it can be gardening, anything that someone enjoys doing. Getting to sleep on a consistent schedule. And for most people, shifting it a bit earlier. I think on average, we tend to go sleep later than is ideal. Trying to reduce stress, just general kind of techniques there, anything from journaling to meditation to breath work. The basics here make a huge difference when it comes to general metabolic health, when it comes to how well our mitochondria are working. So that would be the first starting place I would suggest. And I would say in a lot of cases, that's going to get us to where we need to go. Now, there are situations where we need to dig into a bit more details because maybe maybe we were doing kind of suboptimal things for a long enough time that we've dug ourselves into a bit of a hole, and we've got some kind of lingering chronic issues, maybe in relation to gut health, or maybe metabolically. We're not going to see the reversal as quickly as we might in another scenario. And that's where I would start to get into some more details. So on the gut health side, for example, we can have overgrowths of harmful bacteria that, when we eat certain foods, it actually feeds the bacteria. They produce really irritating, toxic things in our gut, which then actually enter into our bloodstream and create inflammation. There's other factors as well, like we might not be digesting our food particularly well if we don't have strong stomach acid or digestive enzyme production or bile flow. We can have very slow motility where the food isn't moving through our intestines very well and it's sitting there and getting consumed by bacteria. There's a lot of ways that things could go wrong in terms of gut health. And if that was the case, we might need to make some more changes beyond just eating whole foods. We might need to make a bit more of a point to reduce some of the harder to digest foods that are more likely to feed any bacterial overgrowth that we have. So some of the foods I would be more careful with would be grains, nuts, and seeds, which are generally a lot harder to digest unless we prepare them in the more traditional ways by fermentation or soaking and sprouting, which makes them more digestible. A lot of raw vegetables as well, especially the very fibrous ones. And sometimes even the cooked vegetables too, depending on our digestive health, depending on our microbiome, can still be feeding bacteria, producing some, again, very harmful compounds. And that can be, and those harmful compounds, not only are there direct mechanisms where they block mitochondrial respiration, they block the engine from converting the fuel into energy, but they're also found in insulin resistance and diabetes. They're one of the main toxic compounds produced by bacteria in our intestines is called endotoxin, and severe endotoxin levels will happen in like severe infections and can be deadly. It can be fatal. It's like a leading cause of death when people are immunocompromised. But moderate levels of endotoxin is called metabolic endotoxemia. And this is something that's found in pretty much every chronic health condition, everything from cardiovascular disease to diabetes to neurodegenerative conditions, autoimmune issues. And what we're basically finding is overgrowths of harmful bacteria in the gut, which are then producing a lot of this endotoxin, which then gets absorbed and blocks a lot of things from working well, including the engines of our cells. So this is a central piece when it comes to insulin resistance and might be a major area to focus on if someone has made some of the more general changes and is still dealing with insulin resistance, and maybe is also noticing things like bloating or gas or issues with motility like constipation or diarrhea, kind of either side there. Any sort of like aching or irritation or pain, like those could all be signs that either we're not digesting our food well or it's feeding bacteria which are producing compounds that are pretty harmful to us. So that would be kind of a next area, and there's maybe, there's a few more I would consider kind of some next steps after that, but I'll let you jump in first, Lily.
Well, I was just going to mention on the sleep topic that you had said that I think that sleep is so important because I have people who are eating healthy. They're not moving as much as they probably could be, but they're eating the healthy, clean diet, but they're getting 2 hours of sleep a night. And like, I'm holding all this water retention, or my blood markers are moving in the wrong direction. I don't get it. I'm eating healthy. I'm like, yeah, but you're not sleeping. That's like the foundation to health. So I'm glad that you mentioned sleep because it's overlooked, and I think it's not as of a... For some reason, I find people just don't want to talk about sleep. They want to say, just tell me, should I eat 2 more eggs a day? Or what's the one thing I should be eating to be able to become healthier? And it's like, yeah, but sleep, you got to do that. If you're not doing that, the whole body's not going to be working, as sleep's our body's time to rest, recover, and repair itself.
Yeah. And poor sleep and insulin resistance are very well tied. And you can see just one night of poor sleep, the effects on reproductive hormones, testosterone for men and progesterone for women, the effects on stress hormones, the effects on insulin resistance, the effects on weight. There are studies where they have groups eating the same diet. And there's one in particular where one group has 5.5 hours of sleep per night and the other gets 8.5. And there's a massive difference in the amount of body fat loss and lean mass loss, despite doing the same thing in terms of diet and exercise. Massive difference. I want to say it's like 40% differences. So yeah, it's really not something that we can understate. And you mentioned 2 hours a night, but really even, I'm going to say 6 is not cutting it. Really 7 isn't either. Obviously less is worse. So, 7 is a lot better than 5, and that's great. If you're currently sleeping 5 hours and we get to 7 on average, that's great. But we really should be shooting for at least 8 on a nightly basis.
Jay, do you have kids?
Not yet.
Okay, so I just think about my moms. I think about the people who I talk with who are like, oh yeah, I have to wake up a few times in the night, or my kids aren't falling asleep till later, so I just end up staying up with them. And so I guess like, what are your actionable steps for people to get better quality sleep? Because that's like a hard one.
Yeah, well, and they're especially when kids are really young, getting woken up throughout the night and things like that is, at least it seems, it kind of comes with the territory. And there's going to be certain things in our lives at times that might prevent us from getting good, consistent sleep. And I don't think there's anything that we want to do to make us sleep through our kids waking up or something like that necessarily. But what I would say is the times when that's not happening, let's make sure we have really good sleep habits and maybe we're using some extra support so that we are sleeping well throughout the night. And so a few things that I think are worth mentioning there are highlighting. So one would be having both a morning and evening routine. And it doesn't have to be long, in the evening, it could be 20 minutes, but having some time to decompress and kind of get into your routine for relaxing and getting to sleep can make a huge difference. In the morning, making sure that we get out of bed right away, as opposed to kind of snoozing the alarm clock over and over, getting really kind of poor quality sleep makes a big difference. So making sure we get out of bed right away, trying to get some morning sunlight is also something that really helps to tell our bodies that now is time to be awake. And that helps on an ongoing basis too, because then at night, our bodies recognize that it's time to go to sleep. And so with that, the current lighting that we have can make a big difference. If we have really bright white lights on at night and then we just turn those off and try to go to sleep, our bodies are thinking it's still daytime. So light in the morning, like real sunlight, makes a huge difference. And then at night, trying to keep the lights down, using red light filters and things like that on your screens makes a big difference when it comes to sleep. Also, a central thing that we're talking about today is carbohydrates. And when it comes to turning down the stress hormones, which are the ones that keep us kind of amped and awake and prevent us from getting good quality sleep, the carbohydrates are massively important. And I know you've talked about this when it comes to your sleep quality, is that you need to eat some carbohydrates. And I think there are a lot of issues that I see that crop up over time when people are on low carb carnivore diets. But I think sleep is one of the most common, one, if not the most common symptom, at least early on. And that's because we're really amplifying those stress systems when we're not getting those carbohydrates in. So, not only getting enough throughout the day, but making sure in the evening, especially with dinner or even a small snack with some fruit before bed, can help to turn that stress down so that we can not only fall asleep, but also stay asleep. Because during the night, while we're asleep, our bodies are working. They're using fuel. We're doing a lot of repair and regeneration. Our brains are still active, and all of that requires fuel. And when we're not eating, we have to rely on the fuel that we've stored or just eaten. And so if we have enough carbs throughout the day and maybe a little bit extra in the evening, that'll help to make sure that those glycogen stores or carb stores are full so that we have enough to get through the night. A lot of times, if somebody wakes up during the night, especially has this like trouble falling back asleep or any sort of heart racing, bad dreams, or any like kind of consistently at the same time every night, that's often a sign that we've run out of our stored glycogen and our bodies are wanting more fuel. The stress system's activated and it's waking us up and preventing us from falling back asleep. If that happens, we can actually have, a little bit of fruit or something like that, or a spoon of honey, and that can help us fall back asleep. But we can also make sure to just get enough throughout the day to prevent that from happening. And that can make a huge difference. And it's a really clear relationship where what's supposed to happen with our sleep is we're supposed to have enough fuel to get us through the night, repair, regenerate. And then as we run out, we have this what's called like the dawn phenomenon. And we kind of talked about this with fasting blood sugar, where we're supposed to have a peak of stress in the morning. That's our natural alarm clock. But what happens if we don't have enough fuel stored and we're not using it very well or efficiently? That happens earlier. So it might happen at 3 a.m. instead of 6 a.m. or 2 a.m. or something like that. And so then we wake up, we don't have any fuel. And if that's happening, it could be a sign that we're not getting enough carbs in throughout the day. And we could have a little bit when we wake up or during the day, make sure to get a bit more.
So you said make sure that you're having enough carbohydrates throughout the day. How many is enough? And does that matter depending on if somebody, again, has insulin resistance already? Or you're like, no, whether you have insulin resistance or not, you should be eating X amount of carbohydrates?
So when it comes to optimal amounts of carbohydrates, there are a few different kind of ways that we can think about it. So our nervous system, including our brain, is one of our major consumers of carbohydrates, unless we're getting ketones. If we're not getting ketones, our brain is running fully on glucose. And in that case, we need at least about 120 grams of carbs, somewhere in the 100 to 150 range, just to fuel our nervous system. So that's not fueling muscles, it's not fueling kidneys, it's not fueling anything else. That's just for our nervous system to function, just for our brain to function. And we want to remember, just like any other area of our bodies, if our brain runs out of fuel, that triggers stress, that triggers cortisol, that triggers anxiety and irritability. It is the same signal that causes fat storage, something we don't want to happen. So that's where we're kind of talking in terms of minimums in that 100 to 150 gram range. But again, that's now not accounting for all the other areas of our bodies that use carbohydrates, especially if we're active, if we're doing resistance training or any sort of sport. Our muscles will be using some carbohydrates at that point, also be using some fat too. It's a mix. And other tissues use carbohydrates as well. A lot of our different organ systems like to use carbohydrates. So, I mean, that's when we're talking minimums, I would probably say 150 to 200 for most people. But again, that's where I would be having a low end in terms of like minimums.
Wow, cool. So I think you watched the video I sent over to you about like why I quit carnivore. And one of the things that I said is that I ended up bringing back in about 150, 200 grams of carbohydrates. And now maybe it was that I did it too quickly. Maybe my body wasn't used to it right away. But I really broke out in some acne. And actually it didn't happen right away. It wasn't until like 3 weeks, 4 weeks, and then it just kept getting worse and worse. My acne got really bad, and you have great skin. So do you think that there's any validity to sugar feeding onto skin problems or acne or psoriasis or candida?
So there are, kind of like we talked about before, when it comes to taking out carbohydrates, there are a few ways that it can help a lot. And this then tells us where things can go wrong when we add them in. So one, and obviously this doesn't apply to you, is that where most people are getting their carbohydrate sources, or the sources for carbohydrates for most people are not ideal, right? Whether we're talking pizza, donuts, things like that. So just taking out those can help a lot. But we also talked about gut health, right? And the impact of overgrowth of bacteria and imbalances there. And most of the overgrowths like to consume fibers and carbohydrates. And certain carbohydrates that we eat have a lot more fermentable carbohydrates, meaning the ones that feed bacteria. Some have a lot less. And I would say this is probably other than cutting out a lot of those kind of bad foods, this is the number one reason why people experience a lot of benefits when they do fasting or carnivore or low carb diets, is that they're no longer feeding this imbalanced gut microbiome. And so while this can be a major benefit when taking out carbohydrates, it also means that when we're bringing them in, this is one of the most common areas that can create symptoms. And oftentimes when we go low carb, it doesn't actually fix the microbiome. It just kind of avoids the problem like we talked about. The same thing happening with blood sugar and insulin. When that happens and then we bring those same carbs in, we can then start feeding that microbiome again. And I think that is a primary area that can cause symptoms. And so if someone is feeling worse at all when bringing in carbohydrates, I would take a real close look at the types of carbohydrates we're bringing in. So, we talked about whole foods and wanting to maybe start with like fruits and root vegetables, and those are great, but some of those carbohydrate sources have a lot of fibers and fermentable carbohydrates that we don't digest and that go ahead and feed bacteria. If we are experiencing these symptoms, the first thing I would want to do is shift away from the types of carbohydrates that are really high in these fermentable carbohydrates. And this is when we're talking fruits, the ones that are highest are going to be apples, pears, stone fruits like peaches, plums, nectarines, cherries. Watermelon is another one. There's a couple others that are kind of moderate, but those are kind of the quote worst offenders when it comes to carbohydrate sources that will feed bacteria a lot. Again, if we have a healthy microbiome, it shouldn't be an issue. It should actually really help in terms of maintaining a healthy microbiome. So this is not like these are universally bad, but if we're having symptoms when bringing carbs in, we might want to reduce those forms of carbohydrates and shift toward what are like lower fermentable carbohydrate fruits. And we could even try some fruit juices or maybe some starches that are lower in fermentable carbs as well. So white rice is one that is normally very well digested and not going to feed bacteria. When it comes to potatoes and sweet potatoes, there are some fermentable carbs in there, so we want to keep an eye on that. So we might want to favor, again, some of those really easy to digest ones. And the last thing I'll say here is one way that we can know if our symptoms are being caused by this gut issue is if we're noticing intestinal irritation, if we're having bloating, gas, stomach aches, anything else along those lines, shifts in motility, like in an uncomfortable way, that's probably a sign that there's a bacterial issue here and we're feeding it by adding the carbohydrates in.
Okay. And one of the other things you had mentioned too was fasting. And fasting, I think, having benefits as far as autophagy and more brain cognition, mental clarity, but also I think that it tends to put people in a chronically energy deficient state, calorie deficient state, where then they may be experiencing things like hair loss, menstrual cycle loss, muscle wasting, low energy, slower metabolism, impaired thyroid function from just eating less food in general. Unless you're someone who can do intermittent fasting or OMAD and be able to sit down and eat all you can eat, eat enough. But why would you, or what are your thoughts on fasting as far as helping with insulin resistance?
Yeah, so fasting provides some of those same benefits as the low carb diets, right? When we're not eating those bad foods, and we're providing relief for our gut. And this allows for improvements in the microbiome. It allows for reduction in endotoxin production. So that's great short term. But as we're kind of talking about, there is a cost to those approaches, which is that during that period of time when we're not eating, our bodies are recognizing there's no fuel coming in and there's not energy being produced, and it activates those stress systems. The same stress hormones we were talking about earlier, we can focus on cortisol, and the main action there is provide fats, provide glucose, induce gluconeogenesis, lipolysis, so that we have the fuel there when we're not eating. And that's great in the short term because it allows us to function. If not, we would die, and that would be really bad, of course. So it's great that we have these systems in place, but long term, that signal tells our bodies that we're not in a supportive environment that's abundant with energy. Instead, we're kind of training our body to expect stress more and more. And in doing so, it starts to downregulate our different systems, our immune function, our digestive function, our reproductive function, because this is not a time to be, providing as much energy as possible and running at full capacity. Our bodies are recognizing it's not sure when it's gonna we're not sure when we're gonna get our next meal. And normally it's, we're going 16 hours without food. And that acts as a signal to turn down those things over time. And that's often what can lead to those symptoms that you mentioned. And I know ones that you experience, like hair loss, for example, which is a really common one from that excess stress. And this plays out throughout our hormonal system because our hormones are like chemical signals throughout our bodies that are saying, here's what's going on in the world, based on what's going on inside. And when we have a lot of cortisol, it tells us to reduce the production of our reproductive hormones, which can interfere with something like menstrual cycles, libido, libido on both sides for men and women, and all sorts of issues on that front. It also interferes with thyroid function. It prevents the conversion from our inactive thyroid hormone to the active thyroid hormone from T4 to T3, and also prevents or reduces thyroid hormone production at the thyroid gland. And our thyroid is the main regulator of our body for our metabolism. Basically, if our thyroid function is high, our metabolic rate is high. If our thyroid function is low, our metabolic rate is low. And anything that is going to chronically increase cortisol is going to turn down our thyroid function to help us survive, to help us adapt to this environment that doesn't have consistent fuel and energy coming in. So because of that, it's something that I would generally not recommend in terms of the outcomes we're looking for, right? I think there can be some of those major side effects you talked about. And the good news here is we can get the relief in terms of our gut health. We can reduce endotoxin production without needing to fast. And we can improve the function of our engine without needing to avoid all the carbohydrates. And in doing so, if we do it in a way that still includes consistent eating, getting enough fuel in, getting the carbohydrates in, we can also do it without stress. Or chronic stress, without chronic cortisol increases. And I would say that's ideal.
There's just two sides to every coin. So yeah, it's very fun talking with you because it's just different. What do you currently eat in a day?
So my diet is pretty balanced and mixed, kind of like we were talking about earlier, talking about kind of changes we might make when it comes to insulin resistance. It's really what I would say is optimal, regardless of whether we're insulin resistant or not, is having a kind of quote well-balanced diet, which is almost meaningless. So I'll get into some details. I will say, of course, my diet changes and fluctuates based on, what's available food-wise and where I'm living at the moment, or testing different things. So this is not supposed to say this is the perfect template. This is just what, maybe I've been eating lately. But normally I'll do 4 meals a day, and those 4 meals each have a protein source. So that might be eggs, or, thinking breakfast, like eggs or some other meat, maybe a pastured bacon sometimes. And then other meals might be lamb or beef, might be shrimp or low-fat fish like mahi or cod or something like that. And then normally some form of carbohydrates as well. That could be fruit, watermelon, oranges, apples, pear. Well, I don't really do pears, but like mangoes or pineapple, basically what's available. And sometimes I'll do some dried fruit or juices as well. And then I'll do some starch too, potatoes, sweet potatoes, occasional white rice. And so each of the meals is kind of a combination of those things. It's never really the same every day. Kind of mix it up. And then I'll normally do a snack depending on how late dinner is. You know, if there's a good chunk of time between dinner and bedtime, I'll normally have a snack then.
And what are your thoughts on plant toxins?
Yeah, so I think it's something to be aware of, especially when our gut health is compromised or other aspects of our metabolism are compromised, because pretty much anything we're interacting with as far as plant toxins go, we have ways to clear out and detoxify. So in moderate amounts, they should be okay. But if we're really struggling metabolically, whether it's with insulin resistance or something else, our ability to break down some of these anti-nutrients can be dramatically reduced and they can cause a lot more symptoms. So we always want to tailor it to the individual, but I do think, I mentioned concerns with the grains, nuts, and seeds earlier. They are really high in these plant toxins, the anti-nutrients, and there are negative effects to these intestinally. They can support the growth of harmful bacteria, and they can cause other issues as well. There's it's a kind of large realm of concerns. There's thyroid inhibiting ones. There's ones that inhibit protein and starch digestion. There's ones that can bind with minerals and prevent their absorption or even cause us to lose certain minerals. So I do think it's worth being aware of. I generally recommend avoiding nuts and seeds, not only because of the anti-nutrients, but they're also very high in the polyunsaturated fats, PUFA, which are the omega-6s, especially in those nuts and seeds, the same ones that are in the seed oils. Basically, that's where they're coming from. And so even though nuts and seeds are the whole food form, they're very high in those fats. So it's not generally something I recommend. The grains are not as high in those, but they are just generally higher in the anti-nutrients. But if they are traditionally prepared by fermentation or soaking and sprouting, it does reduce those levels of the anti-nutrients. So it's something to be aware of. And if we're especially sensitive, I would be aware of those things and maybe lean away from those types of foods. And then raw vegetables are another major source, especially like raw leafy greens. I'd be pretty careful with those. They tend to be pretty high in anti-nutrients, and I would make sure we're at least cooking them thoroughly, but some people do better with avoiding them entirely.
So why would somebody want to eat any sort of plants if they have toxins in them? You're already saying, hey, they might cause different gut issues. They might cause different health implications if you have too many of them. So why would you have any of them at all?
Yeah, well, and there's a spectrum there when it comes to the amount of toxicity and the types. And so when we're looking at that spectrum, I would definitely favor the fruit and root side. And when it comes to the other ones, we can prepare them in a way that minimizes the anti-nutrients. If we're talking about optimal health, I would probably lean away from the grains, nuts, and seeds entirely, and definitely raw vegetables, at least most of, like, again, we're talking asparagus and Brussels sprouts and broccoli and kale. I would say we generally don't want to eat those raw. If they are cooked and we've reduced the anti-nutrients enough, they can still have other benefits that are worth having. But I would say we don't want those to be the centerpiece of the diet, even if they are well cooked. We're not going to be getting our fuel from there. We get some nutrients, but again, there's some balance with the anti-nutrients. So I think the idea that this is what all of our diet should center around is not compatible with the presence of these plant toxins. When we're talking like the cooked vegetables, there's a lot of benefits to the polyphenols and flavonoids in there. They have a lot of benefits in terms of gut health, and they actually help to keep the harmful bacteria growth reduced. So they have natural kind of antibiotic effects, very gentle ones that don't harm the good bacteria. They only keep the bad bacteria at bay. And same with the fibers that are in there as well. If we have a healthy microbiome, it actually helps to further support a healthy microbiome by supporting the growth of the good bacteria. So that's one benefit there. I think there's also benefit to, some people enjoy the taste. There are also vitamins and minerals in there. And if we do break down the anti-nutrients, we do absorb some of those. And that's, of course, valuable. But again, I think there would be a small supplement to the diet when we're talking about something like cooked vegetables, right? This is not the centerpiece, because too much could lead to too much concern when it comes to the plant toxins. So we want to make sure we're reducing them, the plant toxins that is, and having some amount of these. When it comes to the fruits and roots, the amount of plant toxins is really minimal if we're, not eating the skin of the roots. And at that point, we're getting the benefits of the carbohydrates, right? The number one way to turn down cortisol, increase our thyroid activity, our metabolism, improve sleep and immune function, reproductive function, strengthen the gym. So there's a ton of benefits there. They still also have those same polyphenols that help with the gut bacteria, gut microbiome. And they've got a ton of nutrients in there as well that are really hard to get in other places. You get a lot of potassium, magnesium, different vitamins, vitamin C especially, but lots of others in fruits and roots. So there's a lot of benefits to those. The number one place I would recommend people go is to jayfeldmanwellness.com/guide, where they can download a free energy balance food guide. It's a one-page infographic and basically puts all the different foods, all the different food categories on a scale based on how much they support our metabolism and ones that we might want to be more careful with in terms of digestion, some of the anti-nutrients, things like that. All that's factored in there. And there's a couple different scales that will help people, take some of those steps to creating a diet to help with insulin resistance, help with sleep, help with body composition, autoimmune issues, you name it. So again, that can be found at jayfeldmanwellness.com/guide. And otherwise, my podcast is called the Energy Balance Podcast. And I've got a number of different programs and things that can help people along their health journey. And all of that can be found at jayfeldmanwellness.com.
You can find links to Jay's social media handles in the video description. I hope you guys have a happy day, and I'll see you in the next one.